For 3 years, the Royal Navy could not touch it. It sat in a Norwegian fjord called Fjord, deep inside the Arctic Circle, surrounded by torpedo nets, anti-aircraft guns, smoke generators, and a full screen of destroyer escorts. And it did almost nothing. It barely moved. It fired its main guns perhaps a handful of times in the entire war. And yet the British Admiralty spent more hours worrying about it than almost any other single target on Earth. It was called the Tirpitz, and its power was not what it did. Its power was what it threatened to do. The Tirpitz was the largest warship ever built in Europe at that point. 42,000 tons of steel, 8 15-inch guns, and enough speed to run down almost anything that floated. Its sister ship, the Bismarck, had already demonstrated what a battleship of that class could accomplish before the Royal Navy finally caught and sank it in May of 1941. The loss of the hood alone, blown apart in 8 minutes, had shocked Britain to its core, and the Tirpitz was every bit the Bismarck's equal. The British knew it. The Germans knew it. And more importantly, the Germans knew that the British knew it. So it sat there, waiting, and waiting was enough. Every time an Allied convoy had to sail for the Soviet Union, carrying tanks, aircraft, ammunition, medicine, planners had to account for the possibility that the Tirpitz might suddenly leave that fjord. A single battleship forced Britain to maintain an entire fleet of capital ships in the North Sea just to intercept it if it moved. Ships that could not be used elsewhere. Resources that bled away month after month to contain a threat that never fully materialized. Winston Churchill called it the Beast. He said that killing it was one of the most important naval tasks of the war. The Royal Air Force tried bombing runs. They achieved nothing. The Royal Navy sent Midget submarines into the fjord in September of 1943. The crews placed explosive charges beneath the hull and damaged her severely, enough to put her out of action for several months. But she was repaired. She survived, and the Beast returned to its anchor. It was at this point that the Air Ministry received a proposal it had already rejected twice. The man behind it was Barnes Wallis. He was 56 years old, a senior designer at Vickers, and he had 2 reputations. The first was for building things that worked exactly as planned. He had designed the geodetic airframe that made the Wellington bomber one of the most structurally resilient aircraft of the war. The second reputation was more complicated. Senior officers found some of his proposals difficult to take seriously. Not because he was wrong, because what he was proposing seemed, on first reading, to belong to a different world entirely. He had, more recently, designed the bouncing bomb, the weapon that the Royal Air Force used to breach the Ruhr dams in May of 1943, the Dambusters raid. It had made headlines around the world. The Germans were still repairing the damage months later. But before that success, before anyone believed in the bouncing bomb either, Barnes Wallis had spent years quietly working on something he considered even more significant. He called it the earthquake bomb. And when he first presented the concept in 1941, the men in the room looked at his calculations, looked at him, and told him politely but clearly that he had lost his mind. The idea was this: existing bombs exploded on contact. They shattered walls, collapsed roofs, started fires. But against hardened targets, reinforced concrete U-boat pens, thick-walled fortifications, a battleship armored to withstand direct naval gunfire, they were essentially useless. The armor absorbed the blast. The concrete swallowed the detonation. You could drop conventional bombs on the Tirpitz all day and do little more than scratch her paint. Wallis wanted to go underneath. His concept was a bomb so heavy and so aerodynamically refined that it would reach close to the speed of sound before impact. At that velocity, it would not detonate on the surface. It would penetrate deep into the earth beside a structure or through the deck of a ship and only then explode. And when it detonated underground, the effect would not be a conventional blast radiating outward through air. It would be a shockwave moving through rock and soil and water, an artificial earthquake, undermining foundations from below, cracking structures that no amount of surface armor could protect, causing the kind of catastrophic collapse that simply could not be defended against, because there is no armor plate thick enough to stop the ground itself from moving. The Air Ministry's response was essentially dismissal. The bomb would need to weigh 12,000 pounds to achieve the required penetration velocity. No aircraft in service could carry 12,000 pounds and still reach the target. The aerodynamic precision required was, in the view of several senior officials, theoretical rather than practical. And the idea that a crew could drop a bomb with sufficient accuracy from high altitude in wartime conditions, that a weapon could be placed within the precise distance from a target needed for the underground shockwave to be effective. One officer reportedly described that portion of the proposal as medieval thinking dressed in mathematics. Wallis revised his figures. He came back. He was rejected again. He came back a third time. And this time, partly because of the Dambusters, partly because the Tirpitz problem had become genuinely urgent, and partly because a small number of people inside the Air Ministry had quietly started to believe he might be right. They gave him a conditional approval. Build the bomb, prove the penetration figures, then they would consider the rest. The bomb he built was called the Tallboy. 12,000 pounds of hardened steel casing, machined to tolerances that pushed the limits of what British manufacturing could achieve at the time. Inside the casing was 5,500 pounds of Torpex explosive, a compound roughly 40% more powerful than TNT by weight. The tail fins were set at a slight offset angle, like the flights on a dart, to spin the bomb as it fell and give it gyroscopic stability. Without that spin, a weapon falling from high altitude would begin to tumble. It would arrive at an angle. It would not penetrate cleanly. With it, the Tallboy would arrive nose first at very close to the speed of sound, carrying enough kinetic energy to punch through 16 feet of reinforced concrete before the fuse triggered the detonation. Think about that for a moment. 16 feet of reinforced concrete. The U-boat pens on the French coast that had resisted every previous bombing campaign for years were built with 14 feet of roof. The Tallboy would go through them, not around them, not alongside them, through them. The bomb entered service in the summer of 1944. 617 Squadron, the same men who had flown the Dambusters raid, were retrained in the specialist delivery technique the Tallboy required. High-altitude release, extreme precision. A method of flying that demanded everything from the crews who attempted it. The first operational results arrived almost immediately, and they were not subtle. In June of 1944, a Tallboy strike collapsed the railway tunnel at Saumur in southern France, cutting a key German reinforcement route toward Normandy at a moment when every hour mattered. In August, strikes hit the U-boat pens at Brest and Bordeaux, the same pens that years of conventional bombing had barely marked. In September, for the first time in the entire war, a weapon actually struck the Tirpitz. The bomb hit the water 45 feet from the hull, and the subsurface shockwave was severe enough to cause significant structural damage below the waterline. One bomb from a Lancaster at 18,000 feet, and the Tirpitz was in dry dock again. The Germans moved her south, away from the threat. They positioned her in shallower water near the Norwegian town of Tromsø, inside what their calculations suggested was a range boundary, close enough to the Arctic that a Lancaster carrying the full weight of a Tallboy could not reach her and still have fuel to return home. They were wrong, but only just. It is the 12th of November, 1944. You are a crew member aboard one of 32 Lancaster bombers crossing the Norwegian coast at low altitude, below radar. The aircraft around you are stripped of everything that is not essential. Armor removed, turrets reduced, fuel tanks modified, everything done to squeeze out the extra miles of range the mission requires. The bomb beneath your aircraft weighs 12,000 pounds. The temperature outside is far below freezing. And somewhere ahead, through thin, broken cloud, the Tirpitz is at anchor with her crew at battle stations and her anti-aircraft guns already tracking the sound of approaching engines. The cloud breaks. There she is, 42,000 tons of steel. 3 years of Allied planning, failed raids, dead submariners, and diverted fleets. All of it sitting still in grey Norwegian water. The first Tallboy strikes slightly forward of the main mast. It does not stop at the deck. It passes through the inner deck, and detonates inside the hull. The second strike hits amidships. Something inside her, a magazine or something close to one, catches the detonation and amplifies it. And then slowly, with a kind of slow inevitability that is somehow more disturbing to watch than any explosion, the Tirpitz begins to roll. 30 degrees, 60. The guns point upward at the sky, as if still searching for the aircraft that ended her. and she keeps rolling, past vertical, all the way over, until 42,000 tons of the German Navy's most feared weapon is lying upside down in the mud of a Norwegian fjord, with her keel showing above the waterline. Roughly 1,000 German sailors died in those minutes. The Royal Navy had spent 3 years trying. Barnes Wallis's bomb took 2 strikes. He heard the news at his desk. Colleagues who were there that day remembered him as very quiet about it. One of them said he simply picked up his pencil and went back to the drawing board. He was already working on what came next. What came next was the Grand Slam, 22,000 pounds, the largest conventional bomb used in the Second World War. Wallis had originally proposed it alongside the Tallboy, and the Air Ministry had rejected the Grand Slam concept even more firmly than the first one. A Lancaster, they said, simply could not carry 22,000 pounds. Wallis modified the Lancaster. The bomb bay doors were removed, the airframe was adapted, everything non-essential was stripped, and the Grand Slam flew. It was first used against the Bielefeld railway viaduct in Germany in March of 1945. One bomb. It dropped 105 feet of a viaduct that had survived every previous attempt to destroy it. Albert Speer, the German armaments minister, later said that the earthquake bomb campaign caused infrastructure damage that was effectively irreparable under wartime conditions. You cannot rebuild a viaduct in a month. You cannot pour new concrete over a U-boat pen while a war is ongoing around you. The bombs did not just destroy targets. They removed them from the war permanently. Barnes Wallis received a knighthood after the war. He kept working. He pursued ideas in variable geometry aircraft design, what we now call swing wing, that were 20 years ahead of the technology needed to build them. He filed patents into his 80s. He died in 1979, aged 92, having spent more than 60 years making things that other people had told him were impossible. The Air Ministry's written assessment of the earthquake bomb concept, produced in 1941, included the phrase of no practical military application. That document still exists in the British National Archives. Someone kept it. Perhaps they thought it was worth remembering what the experts said. They called his bomb medieval. They called his mathematics theoretical. They rejected him twice and nearly rejected him a third time. He just kept doing the calculations, because the calculations were right. They always had been.